Okay, we're ready to go here. So now we're on to the panel portion of our conference. And our first panel, the moderator is David Redl, who is former Assistant Secretary of Commerce for Communications and Information and former NTI administrator. And I worked for him for several years. Over to you, David.
Thanks, Keith. In the spirit of keeping the introductions to a minimum and having people look up people's rather extensive bios, since everyone on this panel is fairly well-traveled in Spectrum circles, I will be very brief with my introductions. First up, we have Jennifer Warren, who's Vice President Technology. Actually, I think this is wrong. This is your old one. Vice President Civil and Regulatory at Lockheed Martin. How dare I have the wrong old title. At Lockheed Martin Corporation's Government Affairs Group. She also sits on the CSMAC, which is the Commerce Spectrum Management Advisory Committee, since I'm not allowed to use acronyms without defining them, per Phil. And in her role there, she does spectrum, unmanned aerial systems, commercial space and launch, ocean minerals, and a host of other issues related to their civil and regulatory matters. Tom Power is the Senior Vice President and General Counsel of CTIA, a role he has held since 2015. I would define CTIA, except I'm pretty sure now it's an orphaned acronym and doesn't actually stand for anything. So
we say that all the time.
Boy, I tossed that one up real high.
I'm so sorry.
That was good. That was good.
You left well, this will be a fun panel. So Tom's the SVP and General Counsel at CTIA. Greg Guice is in Public Knowledge. Public Knowledge, for those that aren't aware, is a civil society group in Washington that looks out for the public interest in a host of areas, including spectrum policy. And Dr. Jordan Gerth from the University of Wisconsin, who holds not one, not two, but 3 degrees from the same university, which is impressive in its own right, is a physical scientist and leveraged observations lead at the NOAA National Weather Service Office of Observations, among his many other achievements. So having given a sort of headline of who we have here, I'd like to start by picking up on one of the threads that Austin had as part of her speech, which is that, you know, one of the things we need to do as a group that works on spectrum policy is find ways to make sure we have a standard set of definitions. And coming into a conference that talks about the highest and best use and talks about efficiency and talks about harmful interference, I wanted to start by asking the group, given your particular perch in the spectrum space, what do you consider harmful interference when you're looking at new uses? And Jordan, I'm going to start with you because it's always good to put a professor on the spot.
All right, well, thank you, and nice to see many of you for the first time. Look forward to interacting throughout this next day and a half here. So I'll give a provocative answer to this, and then I'll walk it back a little bit. But from the perspective of meteorologists and passive microwave remote sensing, we are just listening to the atmosphere. So some members of our community feel that all interference is harmful because there is no easy way for many of our instruments that are deployed currently to determine what is coming from a terrestrial source and what is being produced by the atmosphere. Now, it gets much more complicated than that because the use of microwave remote sensing is quite broad. We have many different bands that we use. And the challenge becomes, what is really making the most significant impact in the weather forecast? Our incentive of spectrum use isn't necessarily profit-driven. It's by making the best weather forecast possible. And the best weather forecast possible requires the best, highest quality observations. And any bit of interference with that introduction of a terrestrial source would lessen the quality of those observations. So it's quite the challenging problem for us. And the other thing I'll mention about this is when we talk about weather observations, weather is global, impacts are local. So we can talk about spectrum policy in the United States, but that may be making the weather forecast better for Europe because weather is moving usually from west to east, in some cases in hurricanes it moves from east to west in the tropics. So whatever we do as a leader, we have to make sure that there's a consensus internationally along that, because interference in one part of the world is nearly as harmful as interference in large segments of the world. So I'll start with that and then we'll follow up.
Great, Greg, you usually work with the unlicensed community, which is coming from a completely different perspective.
Right. Is there harmful interference, right? So, yeah, I mean, look, unlicensed is generally designed to accept all interference and to operate in a way that they account for that and try to adapt around it. And I think that's an important underpinning. But I think generally, to me, harmful interference is a degradation of service that doesn't meet the expectation of the licensed user, right? So that's the way courts look at it. That's, I think, the way the FCC kind of looks at it. And that's sort of the baseline. Now, I would say, in addition to that, like, not all harmful interference is actionable harmful interference, right? So even the DC Circuit has said that, licensees can expect interference for sure, and all spectrum gets interference. But they should also expect that there will be harmful interference on which they cannot expect to be compensated. And so understanding that environment, I think, is important, particularly as we move forward where we are intensifying the use and packing folks really close together. So I think that's what I would say on harmful interference.
Tom, you obviously represent licensed commercial wireless users who are typically the ones who are coming into a band and being either displacing someone or being made adjacent to an existing user. So how is it that you all look at this question when you're looking at it? I'm being buzzed off the stage.
Harmful interference. There's actually, you're asking the wrong people. There's only one person who knows the answer to that question.
This ought to be good.
It's Julie Knapp.
That's
Yes.
true.
He still won't tell us.
We can all agree on that.
I thought when he retired, he would. No, we've never answered this question because it is so case specific, right? It's who are you protecting? Who is claiming interference? And we heard, it just depends on the use case you're up against. And I think that's why it's a recurring question that there's no, the Supreme Court justice who was asked about pornography and said, I know it when I see it.
Otter Stewart.
I think, thank you, Professor.
The law school, come on.
So I don't think there's any great answer to it. We just have to solve these one at a time.
Jennifer, your company deploys both very high powered systems and relatively low power systems. So you must have a unique way of looking at things as well.
Well, I'm going to surprise everybody and say I kind of agree with Tom, which is it is very
That I can leave now.
but it is very use case specific, right? I mean, basically, it's what impairs the effectiveness of the equipment to deliver on the mission to which it contributes, and that can be a low power, high power, mid power, very different from a radar to a satellite earth station to a certain type of sensor. And again, I say radar as if there's one radar, right? I think many know we're talking about dozens of different purposes that radars can serve. And so they all have different sensitivities and what level of impairment that they can have into their data that they then deliver to a larger system is pretty important from a national security, weather prediction, modeling. Sorry to talk weather for a second. So again, I think it's very use case specific, and it's very much, one of the things that wasn't mentioned in all the things, efficiency and highest and best use is effectiveness. And that's really important element as well. That's one of those intangibles perhaps that Austin was talking about, but the effectiveness of the equipment, of the mission for which that equipment is deployed. It's not just about efficiency, because efficiency and harmful interference, there is no one size fits all. It varies by technology and purpose.
Well, it tees up sort of one of the questions that we had all discussed ahead of time that we really want to discuss, which is risk tolerance. And how you look at risk tolerance as a function of making new spectrum available. Jordan, you hit on the fact that in EESS, the Earth Exploration Satellite Services, that any interference really fundamentally changes your predictions. Jennifer, I think you're hinting at sort of the challenge when you have a system that is necessary for national security where the definition of effectiveness is we didn't get blown up. So how do you, as you look at these things, how do you square the need for us to find more ways to make spectrum available for the public with the fact that some of these systems just are not going to be able to be degraded at all? And Tom, I'm happy to let you take the first lead on that, since you guys are usually the ones coming in.
that's sort of the flip side of your first question, I think.
It is.
Yes,
It's the inverse, which is why I'm giving you a second bite because you punted on the first one.
Well, here I go again. Because I think it's the same answer. It's just so case specific. I think one of the challenges we see, especially when we talk about government uses, is the difference between the private sector and the government when it comes to incentives, efficiencies, investment, return on investment. Like wireless companies have an opportunity cost if they are investing unwisely. The government just is a completely different model. And if DoD or any other agency is looking to protect their interest, it's one thing if they are advancing their technologies the way we're advancing ours. But so often we see the case, whether it's DoD systems or other technologies and other verticals, where because it's the government, because they have a hard time getting appropriations for a whole separate set of reasons, and don't have the same incentives for efficiencies that the private sector has. And I think that's one of the things we run into all the time, and that's not DoD's fault, for sure. But it is a challenge when you look at the increases in efficiency on the private side, and I just don't think they exist to the same extent on the government side. We don't really know, but you can look at the changes in mobile data traffic over the last. Austin was citing some of our numbers. It's just continuing to skyrocket, and it's going to keep going up that way. So we keep investing, $35 billion in CapEx last year alone. And that's going to continue, and densification of networks and all that stuff. And then you look at the government side, and they just don't have the same ability to do that. But it means it holds back the efficiency of their systems. And then it causes these challenges when we are trying to move in, as you say.
Is there something to be said knowing that there's going to be these challenges as you put new and higher powered terrestrial systems next to existing government users to be reconsidering the old concept of neighborhooding? This was the old concept that everyone liked to throw out, that we're going to have a satellite neighborhood where it's lower power. We're going to have a terrestrial neighborhood where it's higher power. Is that an idea we should revisit, or has technology overtaken that conversation?
So I look up and I see Paul Colazzi in the audience because he did try to father that idea 15 years ago, I think, 20 years ago. We may have missed the window for that. The retrofitting and the relocation angle of that, I think, would be well outside the bounds of reality. But had we been much earlier in the process, I think Paul's idea was a great idea. But I want to go back, to the efficiency. If I could, can I take us back a step? In comparing, I'm very glad the government doesn't have the same efficiency standard in some ways, because government and the industry that's doing the R&D and developing the technologies to replace existing systems across government agencies, we do the R&D, we do independent IRAD, as we call it. There's also CRADA, et cetera, and don't ask me what CRADA stands for.
Cooperative Research and Development Agreement.
Some of these acronyms you get too deep into, but they don't deploy systems before they're technologically mature. That's not the same. We all know the software upgrades, the bugs, the this, the that. They don't want to be replacing systems that aren't at a technology readiness level of a 9, an 8, unless it's in theater for a particular purpose that they need to respond to. So there's a very different metric of efficiency for a commercial wireless, going from 3G to 4G or just the next handset, to changing out a missile defense warning system, right? To use the most extreme. But I just wanted to put that out there because I think when we talk about efficiency, we fail to distinguish and differentiate.
I would just add, I think that Tom makes a good point. Look, the appropriators have to appropriate for government agencies to move. And the only way that they feel, I would say, that congressional appropriators feel comfortable appropriating is if they know that their investment is in a space where it will last, right? So it gets back, I think, to a core question is, what is our national spectrum policy? Right? So if agencies are looking and there's, a new flavor of like, this is the spectrum we want, and we want it within 7 years. Appropriators think on a much different timeline, right? Their timeline is long-term, and they're trying to figure out what to invest in. So I think that has to be recognized as one of the hangups to trying to do these sorts of things. But that said, I think, on the neighborhooding concept, I think technology has sort of maybe overtaken that. We have found ways that we can use sensing capabilities. We can use database management to sort of allow folks to exist in neighborhoods more close to each other where maybe they couldn't have before. And that might be the better effort.
I would just note one thing. Whether satellite missions particularly launches, our design lifetime is, our planning stage sometimes takes 5 to 7 years. The design lifetime of that satellite can take 7 years and sometimes lasts even longer. We have satellite systems that are sensing in the passive microwave now that were launched in the late 90s. We're still using those. So insofar that we might be able to evolve the receivers and the technology that's on weather satellites to work around some of these sharing issues, that's maybe a possibility, but it is going to take us a lot longer time than the timeframes for some of these sharing arrangements that are proposed.
Well, it leads to another way to bring up another topic that's been raised along this time. The Congressional Budget Office, which is obviously playing a major part in how Congress looks at this, only looks 10 years out. So you've got satellite missions that are in the tens of years. You've got CBO looking at 10 years, and you've got the wireless industry iterating multiple times in a decade. As we look across these different challenges, you raised the receiver question. Is it time for us to be looking at not just how we look at transmitters, but how we look at receivers over the course of a longer time span, understanding that some of them will not be able to be changed out in a relatively timely or economic manner?
That is a question that FCC has teed up, as we all know. Absolutely, it's time to kind of start thinking about that. And, Public Knowledge, along with OTI, has put a proposal on the record to say, hey, maybe we should think of this not so much as like a receiver standard, where we look at every receiver and try to figure this out, but think of it as a FCC sort of saying, we'll adopt a standard receiver standard, right? And so we'll think about it as, what are the types of receivers that we're going to try to protect, and what are the ones that we're not? And tee that up at the beginning of any NPRM, so that basically you take a census of what's out there, so you understand what NOAA and others might have. And you look at what's the lifeline of that equipment, what are the upgrade potentials, how do you balance those costs, and you sort of build that record, and then you talk about like, okay, under this sort of new spectrum band, these are what we will protect, and these are the folks that won't have a cause of action. And you move forward down that path, and you sort of manage those expectations. It also has the benefit of very early in the process of getting equipment manufacturers and licensees that are incumbent in a band to sort of put their cards on the table so that we address the issue of people. I think Austin got a question from somebody coming very late in the process to the table to say, hey, it's not going to work for us. So you try to incentivize them to step forward early so that you can manage around that.
Only because Greg brought it up. I do think there is a misperception about what early in the process is. I think when the FCC process is live and it's 2018, that's not late in the process to be bringing up these issues. And as a friend of mine and we were just discussing before this panel, there's a difference between bringing up politically and bringing it up technically. Technically, it was brought up in the proceeding.
Yep.
It wasn't resolved technically in the proceeding, it was punted. Right. So it was not that these issues about this what is it, the Voldemort of proceedings that we don't want to talk about.
Those that shall not be mentioned by name.
Thank you. It's not that actually that it was late players into the proceeding, is what was visible to the public may have been late, and I mean through the press, as opposed to into the docket. If anybody actually goes to the docket and goes back to the initial proceeding and the initial FCC, you will see comments from the Aerospace Industries Association, from Lockheed Martin and others who raised this issue at the very beginning. So I don't think it's actually a lack of visibility. I think it goes back to how do we get everybody around the table? And I love the question that the student asked over here about, are there other models that are helpful. And while we have challenges in our model, one of the things that Ofcom does very well in the UK is it actually brings everybody around the table together. Now they have a different, they don't have that same problem with executive branch and independent agency to overcome. But you have everyone at the table talking early on. And that's a convening function, which with the way we're structured doesn't work, unfortunately, or hasn't yet worked. It works when there's a crisis, but not as a norm.
So I'll raise this as a provocative question. Is part of the problem we have, one of our root causes, that we no longer have final answers in spectrum policy? There's no final arbiter. The court of public opinion seems to now be the final arbiter of whether or not a spectrum decision has been made in the public interest. Is it time for us to revisit whether or not a final decision is a final decision?
Well, and I'll make a maybe controversial statement here. So I think it is a real shame that regulatees go to their regulator and get them to go to their congressional members and rough people up through that process. I would think that OMB has a role to play in tamping that down. That is the administration speaking. These agencies answer to the administration. But it's obviously this process has become sort of very focused on, it's not federal user spectrum oftentimes, it's regulatees of these federal agencies who use their federal agencies to gain that sort of control.
Now, in fairness to those agencies, and I'll take the contra side just to be fair to those federal agencies.
Sure.
Those federal agencies, in most cases, have their own statute they have to follow that has specific dictates that are not maximize spectrum efficiency.
Right.
So, while I put out there as the court of public opinion the last bastion, should Congress be the place where some of these decisions get hashed out? Because Congress has given contradictory spectrum instructions, safety for the FAA and spectrum for the NTIA, to two different agencies.
Yeah, well, I think under the, sort of the process that we've outlined at the FCC on this, I think you have to take that in as a factor, right? Like, what is the safety profile of the entity that you're looking to bump up against as the incumbent? And that's obviously has to be part of the calculation. Look, Congress does a lot of things well. I think this is one of those areas where it probably does not do well.
Well,
And that's why we have expert agencies on safety and spectrum.
and Congress did establish NTIA as the final arbiter for the executive branch, right? And then the FCC, of course, takes care of commercial. And we're different than other countries in that regard. But I think by and large, some recent examples to the contrary, I think by and large, it makes sense and it can work. And it has worked extremely well in a lot of cases. I think the convening is really important. And that convening, whether it's literally people in the room, which sometimes it has been, or more virtual, but that sharing of information is what's really important. But I think the idea of having the FCC and NTIA on behalf of the executive branch, having to work it out, trying to put another arbiter on top of that, and then if somebody disagrees with that, and if they feel empowered to go to the Hill or to the media or whatever, like that's always going to be a recipe for a disaster.
So, Jennifer, I'll give you 1 second after this. I just want to note on that. I will add on that. Do you think it's a problem that NTIA currently has two missions? To both be the voice of the federal user and be plumbing federal bans for non-federal uses?
I think it's inevitable that it'll vary from administration to administration, but I think it's inevitable that NTIA has to have both of those ideas in mind. They can't, if it's entirely about each agency's mission, then you might as well not have NTIA and have each agency sort of have the veto power. And you need NTIA simply to solve sharing issues between agencies who share spectrum bands all the time. So you need somebody in that role just to be the arbiter of challenges that arise between the agencies, and then that becomes the interface to the FCC on behalf of the executive branch.
Jennifer, thanks for being patient while I delved in a little further.
Oh, no, that was an interesting question. I was interested in the answer. But I wanted to go back to the receiver standard question because I heard what Greg said, and I think it's a little bit more challenging than just taking into account the safety requirements that a receiver might have under another regulator's jurisdiction. So whether it's an RTCA, RTCA, radio, let's see, I can't remember these acronyms, I'm so sorry, folks, but it's the aviation group, RTCA, that does the receiver standards for the FAA for aviation safety. So that is under the FAA's jurisdiction. That's not under the FCC's jurisdiction. Mil-spec standards for military radars, those receivers, that's under the Department of Defense with NTIA, but I will say it's Department of Defense. These aren't things within the FCC's jurisdiction. So the question in my mind is, how does it second guess a receiver standards compliance and ability to perform to the objectives that the safety or mission agencies require? I'm a little conflicted on how that would really work. Does that expand the jurisdiction of the FCC to kind of second guess? I hate to use that term, but to have a second bite at the apple of the receiver. I think there's a lot more to talk about there. Certainly with respect to commercial, it's all within their jurisdiction, and state and local, so public safety. But I know there are some very strong arguments about what would have receiver standards done to a lot of innovation, particularly in the GPS world, if they had been imposed without anticipation of 5G. I don't think we can anticipate constraints that will need to be put in place because maybe someday someone will want to put 8G in that band, right? What gets lost in the interim? And those are the opportunity costs and those types of economic opportunities that you can't quantify, but you know happen when you overly constrain. And then I think Tom's right in his comment about it's worked well to date with a few big, important flare-ups that affect all our lives. So yeah, okay. Other than that, how was the play, Mrs. Lincoln?
I said up front, I was going to say, okay, let's get this out of the way. C-band Legato 3.1. Can we move on?
And I'm moving on. So, but I think that is just it. We are moving on, and I think this FCC and this administration is looking forward because we're talking about spectrum sharing. And that is a very different environment, spectrum sharing, than even adjacent band. And it's pushing players that historically haven't wanted to share to look at sharing. Satellite's lucky. They've always had to share with themselves just by the very nature of it. But other players haven't had to do that, particularly if they're mobile in nature. So, we're moving in that direction, and that forces us to look at spectrum governance very differently because we have stovepiped jurisdictions with NTA really not having authority. They're coordinated with, but they have no authority to limit what the FCC does. So FCC really does have unilateral jurisdiction over all spectrum decisions. In a spectrum sharing environment, is that the right model? I don't know. Again, this has been a great FCC and a great administration discussion to date, but it's something I think that's out there, and I'd love law students to write more articles on that.
Can I just jump in on that? And maybe this is just semantics, but I don't know if what you're talking about is spectrum sharing when you say that a wireless carrier that has 100 million subscribers using the same spectrum, or all the wireless carriers having 300 million subscribers all using the same spectrum, they're sharing the spectrum, right?
Well, you have exclusive geographic areas, don't you?
Yeah, but
Okay, that's what I mean. Satellite doesn't.
Well, therein lies, look, this gets back to our definitional question, right?
Right.
Spectrum can be shared over 3 different domains. And when we talk about sharing, I think people, first of all, sharing in an adjacent channel sense is very different than sharing in a co-channel sense.
Exactly.
And when
I'm
you're
talking
talking co-channel, you have the time domain, the geography domain, and the frequency domain. And some industries are real good at sharing in one of those domains. Some are real good at sharing in another. Most are not good in sharing across the board. And I think that's one of the definitional challenges we've had to face is, as everybody talks about sharing, what does it actually mean?
Right.
And I think it means, this harkens me back to the net neutrality debate where you asked net neutrality advocates what it meant. And if you asked 100 people, you got 100 separate definitions. And I think with sharing, we're getting the same thing. So, again, I feel like I keep pointing you out, Austin, and calling you out, but talking about a shared vocabulary and a shared way of looking at things, I think is part of the challenge we're facing. And this right here was a good example of that. Greg, I don't know if you want to chime in on that. I mean, obviously sharing for unlicensed users is a totally different situation. Coming in as an underlay that is not able to exercise any rights with respect to interference.
Right. I mean, I think that is sort of it, right? I mean, that is what unlicensed is built on. So the innovation, the technology has to be built in that environment. And I think as we look at other sharing technologies and other ways that we might go about sharing, that there are technological answers to some of that, right? So, and I think that is part of what the record building around it is. So maybe it is you can only share geographically. Maybe you can share based on time. So these elements don't all have to package together in one proceeding. There might be different ways in different bands to do the sharing. And I think that is where the FCC's role is important and where it's really incumbent upon folks to sort of state what the basis is of the technology that can be deployed and what are the opportunities that you are going to pursue in that sharing. And so I think that is the role of the agency to ultimately suss out. And the FCC's engineers and folks do they try to do a bang up job. And I think they get it mostly right. Maybe they got it more right when Julie was there, but they do definitely get it mostly.
I don't know, some of these go back away.
The Julie
only
love fest
joking.
continues.
Yeah, but no, I think that's the important role that the FCC can play as we look at these new sharing opportunities.
Jordan, from your perspective, the passive services have just as much of an adjacent channel problem as they do co-channel problem. Do you view this differently than sort of the rest of the debate we've had about sort of active transmit users?
The way that I view this is that for us, if we were asked ultimately to share, we would probably share in time because our satellites are moving so quickly or scanning so quickly that we're not always just staring at one place. Now, our technology is also evolving. I think that one of the challenges that we have with the structure, with the NTIA, with NOAA, is we have to be better about getting the information out there. I remember as soon as the 23.8 gigahertz water vapor sharing proposal hit the news, there was this public discussion about what receiver NOAA was even using to sense in that band. And in addition to that, because of the process for NOAA to work through the NTIA, a lot of the work that NOAA did was not public. And so we lacked the information. We lacked the information in the public fora to have an honest debate about that. And I think that getting the information out there is perhaps the best way to make sure that we're having the most direct conversation possible about receiver standards, about sharing. And there might be some process changes that need to be done, especially as we move into an era where companies now are maybe looking to provide Earth observations in the EESS, Earth exploration band. Because if they want to sell that to improve weather forecasts or whatever their customers demand, they have to have some confidence that for their duration of their mission, that they're not going to incur interference.
Tom, you're usually on the other side of the information imbalance. Do you see it as big a challenge?
Yeah, the information imbalance, you mean?
Between federal and non-federal users.
Yeah, I know. I think it is a challenge. I think, when we're looking for new spectrum bands, and of course, I've seen this from my role today, my role at NTIA, my role at OSTP. At every turn, I've seen this where agencies, for some very good reasons, can't always be transparent, right? Especially when you think about DoD. But we sit there and look at different spectrum bands that would fit very well into the mobile inventory, and you get pushback from DoD, and sometimes it's no. That's the best answer you can get. Sometimes it's a stronger answer, right? And it's sort of a black box. We don't really know what's going on behind the curtain. Like I said, that's not, there's reasons for that, but even when you get inside a skiff, secure, compartmentalized.
Secure compartmented information facility, yeah. Sensitive compartmented information facility.
Oh, right. Even in there, the agencies are not always as forthcoming as they might be. So yeah, there is definitely an imbalance, and some of that's going to be inherent, and some of it could probably be improved.
I'm going to pause. We're a little more than halfway through our time. I want to take a pause and maybe see if there are audience questions before we go back to sort of these. We usually like to start with a student. So the wiser rule in full effect. There's an easy wireless mic joke here. In a Spectrum audience, you can make that joke.
Check. Hi, I'm not a student, but I'm an alum of the ITP program here, and I'm also a veteran who was in a mobile ground radar unit. And I have to tell you, when I first heard about the sharing spectrum with ground radar units and how we would have a registration service in the cloud where we would register where we were and where we were using it, I immediately thought, I don't want people to know where my unit is, right? I don't want that out. I also have 2 daughters that are now serving, and I don't want them vulnerable to that as well. And so I think, we always have to consider that aspect of things. And I really haven't heard a good answer from anybody about if a ground radar unit is using a spectrum that's being shared, how do we keep their location, safe? I mean, and anything can be hacked these days, right? And so if we have someone who, is, looking to find that information, they don't even have to geographically come here. Now they can just get it off of a server somewhere from anywhere in the world. So if anybody has any good answer to that, I would love to hear that.
Anybody want to touch on the national security and privacy dichotomy?
I haven't been real close to that issue. The only thing that I recall people talking about is ways of obfuscating that by signaling that you are in multiple locations when you're not. And so the bad guys don't know which one is real. Of course, one challenge with that is, does that mean domestically, does that mean all those areas are off limits to other uses? Is not terribly efficient, but it would be one way, I think, of addressing the challenge.
So that's highlighting exactly why I'm concerned about effectiveness not being part of the discussion and just efficiency. Because whether it's frequency hopping for that obfuscation or frequency hopping for other purposes, if that's taken away in the name of efficiency, so it's narrower and narrower and narrower, what's the risks that are increased from that? And that's not a convenient conversation for folks to have, but that's part of the conversations that are being had. But there's a lot of R&D that is going on to try to figure out how to increase sharing capabilities without a risk increase. Obviously for the military, for the soldiers on the ground, the war fighters on the ground, or in air, or on the ships. But one of the things that we haven't really transitioned into is what's been done in the privacy world, which is the concept of privacy by design, which is you build it in from the beginning. And this is where I think OEMs from both the wireless industry and the various other industries, including defense and space, aerospace and defense, can work and should work together. How do you move that forward? And we have challenges because we don't have many US OEMs, but we do have ORAN players. How can all of that work together so that we're not constantly trying to retrofit, which is not a good situation because you're going to have those gaps that emerge, and none of us want that result, nor the policy implications of that type of result. But there's not an appetite for that. PATH's DoD has done a great job with, Tom kind of stopped at the
No
last
one's going to
version
try to
of
define
DoD.
paths. No one knows what that acronym stands for anymore. There's just too
I don't
many
even know what it
Ts.
started.
There's too many
with.
T's in it. No one knows. Yeah.
S's.
Too many S's. Yeah.
It's PATHSS, that I can tell you. And basically it's a process that DoD stood up, bringing wireless, unlicensed and licensed, and OEMs of both aerospace defense and wireless together to look at how to share in the 345 to 355 gigahertz band. And there's a classified session and a CUI classified. Oh, this is very challenging. Control and thank you. I'm just terrible with acronyms, I'm sorry.
To be fair, that one's new.
Yeah, but.
One's only like a year and a half old. That one's new.
But anyway, and so they have a classified and a CUI session, and it's really having a different level of discussion. So Tom was right, up until they started this paths, it's very different. It's slow, but it's an important dialogue that's very awkward, but I think productive. I think you guys are in the CUI, but a lot of the carriers and OEMs are in the classified, and it's good.
I would just
I'm
maybe
not-
quickly
go ahead.
add on the question. As resistant as DoD is to these sorts of things, they found CBRs to be very successful, and they're very comfortable with it, and they're very comfortable with the sharing concept. And in fact, in the lower three, it's something that they're looking at right now actively, and I think so. They're getting more and more comfortable with it, and the fact that they don't think it's revealing of secret information, I think is telling, given their resistance.
I mean, given sort of what's going on in paths, do we think that we've sort of turned the corner from looking at efficiency as more users in a given band without essentially telling someone they can't operate anymore, to incorporating the other externalities like you've discussed, Jennifer, like national security and obfuscation of location and privacy and all the other sort of things that have been sort of injected into these conversations over the last 5 years? Do you think we've internalized that into the definition of efficiency yet?
No, I don't think that's been internalized into efficiency, and I think efficiency has been too long identified and defined otherwise, that we won't be redefining it that way. We'll have to be clear.
I would suggest a different way of defining efficiency, which is whether it's on the private sector or the government side, it is how do you accomplish your mission as efficiently as possible?
Sure.
And so my point, I think that when I first started talking about efficiency was simply that to take DoD, if they are operating systems that were designed and built 50 years ago, there's probably a new technology that can be just as effective, perhaps more effective, right? It's just that it costs money. And one of the ways we pay for that, of course, is through spectrum auctions. But that's, it raises, $100 billion in the last 3 years, but it's still a drop in the bucket compared to DoD's needs and the needs of the rest of the federal agencies. So when I say efficiency, I'm not saying reduce the effectiveness of your mission. I'm just saying, might there be a way that you can achieve your mission maybe even better, but using a smaller spectrum footprint?
So that's really interesting, because when you look at some of the more effective missions that are being looked at, it's wide beam, it's wideband. So it's the correlation of efficiency to less spectrum isn't necessarily spot on there. And that's part of the challenges and why sharing, and whichever version of it we want to talk about, has become more important, because whether it's the aerospace industry's private sector, the wireless private sector, or all the different government users, because there's no monolith here of private sector and government, right? We're all part of this ecosystem. Wide bandwidth is, but for IoT, is really the trend everywhere.
Yep. Other audience questions?
So I wanted to go back to the receiver standards issue and wondering why it always seems as though it's the commercial users coming and saying, please improve your receivers, when it seems like the federal people should have just as big of an interest in this. Like the transmitters that are apparently so dangerous to the federal missions exist. They're out there in the world, and it might be nice to say, hey, everyone stay away, and you don't have to pay for the upgrades. But if a bad actor gets their hand on one of these transmitters, isn't that just as dangerous? And therefore, should be an interest in upgrading the receivers to preserve the integrity of the federal mission itself.
Jordan, do you want to start, or?
Yeah,
I would say on that question that the challenge with government agencies is not really having the funding to do that. My experience has been in these types of cases that when there's a spectrum auction or some sharing arrangement, then the government agencies get money subsequently to work into that. The challenge is when we're talking, and I'm approaching this largely from space system satellite instruments. So again, it just goes back to the amount of time that it takes to develop and deploy new equipment. Now, maybe in the small sat era, there is going to be an incentive to refine the radiometers that we have. But as of right now, I don't think that that exists without some really good prodding. I think the one thing that we perhaps can do and should do with passive remote sensing instruments is equipping more with a digital backend to the extent possible, try to filter out some of the out of band or perhaps illegal in band emissions at this time. And there is a satellite out there, SMAP, soil moisture active passive, that does have that capability. And during a break or something, if you're interested, I can kind of show you how that's working. But it's a long hill to climb, as I said, again, because we aren't really dealing with a transmitter, we're dealing with the atmosphere, and we're dealing with an atmosphere that's emitting at very low power. And in order to capture that low power and get the observations we need, we have to design instruments for a very specific specification that may not do well as we move toward, for example, the wideband solutions that have been discussed.
I have to admit, with your question, I find myself wondering, I don't know of, and maybe the panel does, I can't think of an example of CMRS complaining about interference into their bands. And maybe I'm just missing one. If anybody has one off the top of their head, I think typically since Part 27 operates at relatively high power, if you throw out high-powered radar and you throw out traditional broadcasting, it's higher power than most of the other users.
Yeah, I think there may have been some weird one-off.
Maybe some 700 repacking stuff,
Yeah,
but
right,
I can't
right.
think of anything in particular.
Yeah.
From CMR.
Oh, got it.
Right.
I misunderstood.
Right. No, the devices our guys make are pretty good.
So again, it depends on the radars and the purpose how the receiver, what the intent of the receiver is and how wide its aperture is to receive what it's intended to be able to detect, right? I'm happy to go offline and talk about some of the different radars and the different missions. I'm not going to take up the time here, but I'd be happy to have some conversations.
Is it on?
Yep, you're on.
Yeah, we heard you.
I apologize. Have we moved away? This is a great panel discussion, but have we moved away from the era where the engineers, I'm trying to use that term collectively, have not been at the table, and we're kind of moving into an era where we're over lawyering. We do need lawyering, but we've lost the alloying effect of the engineers being a critical component in the early part of these controversies. And this goes to practice, and some of us in this room were involved, but led by Julie Knapp. Back in 2011, the TWG group got together. That was truly scientific. We had interest all across the spectrum, resolving what the true interference position was between the terrestrial and the GPS at that time. So my question, are we over-lawyered?
It's a great question.
I will say point blank, a panel of mostly lawyers is probably going to have a very different opinion.
But I think it's a really important.
It is.
It is a really important question. And the question is not whether or not we should be on this panel, but is what we're saying backed up by our engineers and driven by our engineers in our corporations, in our associations, et cetera. And I would imagine everybody's head is going to nod here. We're not here lawyering or doing regulatory policy for the sake of it. It's driven by the engineering remits that we have been given by our engineers, by those who are designing, developing, manufacturing, whether it's radars, satellites, earth stations, or, everybody's own area.
Austin touched on this, because particularly at the agencies, it's a real need. And I think Julie will tell you, and the folks at NTIA will tell you, that at those agencies, and presumably the others too, it's been a hard slog recruiting folks these days, and I don't know quite what the reason is, whether we need more STEM education generally, science, tech, whatever.
I think we're in an academic institution.
Oh, they got
I think we can get around that.
Whether we need that more generally, or whether it's a particularly acute problem for the agencies, which my sense is it is, but that's an area where I think beefing up the expertise and relying on the expertise, to your point, is critical.
Yeah, I think, look, these are all getting very technical, and there's not going to be just sort of a simple answer that you can glean by looking at the statute and then parsing the words and applying it to what you're trying to do. I think those are the guardrails. What happens inside the guardrails is more and more engineering. So it's a very important voice, and probably, a very large voice that should and must be at that table. I think Tom's right. It's, the federal pay is not great for engineers, and so it's a challenge to get them to come into the agency. It's a great service to do for your country. It sounds like a plug for like the Peace Corps or something, but yeah, I think it's important, and you do see this, like as the FCC grapples in any sort of decision, it's oftentimes a fight amongst the engineers in these reports that their lawyers are submitting, and then going in and backfilling with like sort of the argument. So it's important for the agencies to have their independent resources.
So I'm not a lawyer, I'm a scientist, and I've approached this similar conversation as a matter of scientific integrity. Sometimes you hear about that in terms of things like controversial policy matters like climate change, and higher leaders in the government kind of limiting reports and what gets released. But it goes back to earlier comments I said about getting information out there. As a scientist, I want to interact with other scientists. I was fortunate to have a very broad education, doing a major in political science and mathematics and atmospheric and oceanic science when I was at the University of Wisconsin. So, I try to look at the whole ecosystem of all of those perspectives, and work with our lawyers and policymakers when I see something that's not scientifically defensible to say, let's roll that back, because I don't want to be associated with something that is pushing it. And I think that everybody that I work with understands that some of the arguments we're not going to make just because we're lawyering up and we're going to try to win this argument. So yeah, I'll go back to anything that we can do. Yes, hiring within the government, engineers that are interested in this are important. But anything we can do to make sure that the free flow of information from engineers and scientists that may be government funded through our academic institutions or the government, I think Spectrum X is a great idea that may shed some light on getting information out there, is going to really help evolve this and keep it, as these issues get more technical, in the engineering and perhaps the scientific realm.
I'm going to exercise the moderator's prerogative for a second and say, I actually think I'm going to take a rather provocative position. I think we're under-lawyered. Dueling engineers is the status quo now. Engineers decide that they're going to take fundamentally different premises to reach the conclusion that the industry they're working for has decided they need to reach. I think we're under-lawyered. I think, to Austin's point, we have to have a common discussion about what the end state needs to look like, about what those premises are going into an engineering study. Engineering is a hard science, but it's a hard science based on soft assumptions at the beginning. And those assumptions are fungible. And as long as we are going to continue to have engineers who are given different sets of premises and told, go defend this as the ground truth that is infallible, I don't think we're going to get to the point where engineers are respected in the process the way they should be.
I was just going to add, I think the challenge of engineering hiring is probably exacerbated at the regulatory agencies like the FCC and NTIA, When you look at NASA, NOAA, there's a lot, I mean, they can, I'm sure, use more, but there's an excitement about the mission. So I don't want to suggest that the federal government just has this dearth of ability to recruit. There's a lot of excitement about what's happening in the federal government, whether it's Artemis 1 or next generation satellite space weather. There's just huge excitement. So there is talent there that is coming in, thank goodness. But at the FCC, when we talk about engineering, it's typically looking at comms engineers. There is not, despite Julie having been a leadership attraction for decades, a lot of talent coming in that's really knowledgeable about these other types of systems and uses of spectrum. It's much less. There's some for space, satellite only really, and Earth station. But when you get beyond that, there is a very small, if any, percentage.
I think we have time for one more question if I'm looking at the clock. I'm looking at Nate to see if he's giving me the hook, but I think we got one more question.
Hi, I'm Stephen Meir, and I may be one of the few engineers in the room. And I have a unique perspective of this issue of lawyering versus engineering. So in a past life, I was involved with the evolution of the 911 environment. And as an engineer and a business owner in that space, what I find when I go to DC and when we're working in the legal space is the engineers are summarily dismissed in the 11th hour when the people go into the back room to have the final discussions and the trade-offs in many, many cases. And the nuance, and I had great folks and we had great engineers and I had great lawyers and regulatory folks, but in those discussions in the 11th hour, the nuance often becomes very important and it's not recognized by the non-technical folks. So my comment or my admonition for this would be, you can have these great engineers and you can have the great lawyers, but you need to keep them working together through all the phases and not at some point dismiss one or the other and leave it in a vacuum.
I mean, I think that's as good a summary of the conversation as I could have provided. So seeing as we're at the top of the hour, I'm going to take the opportunity to say thank you to my panelists and thank you to all of you here. And please join me in thanking them for joining us.